Good morning and welcome to the Asset Finance Connect podcast. My name is Edward Peck, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Stephen Bassett. Stephen has spent more than 50 years in asset and business finance. He began his career at Schroders Leasing in the early 1970s and retired from Arkle Finance in 2017. As far as I can tell, just had a quick look at LinkedIn, between those two times, he's worked at all times in the industry, so without gaps. Is that right,
That
Stephen?
is absolutely right. Yeah, always
So
in lending.
longevity in the industry alone isn't what makes Stephen interesting. What matters is that he's seen the industry from almost every angle, from collections, credit, operations, sales, leadership, and so on. And his views are therefore shaped by observation rather than by theory. As you get to know Stephen, if you don't already know him, and most people do, you'll notice that he watches patterns closely. That's his characteristic. He's prepared to call those patterns out, and at times that can make him an uncomfortable voice in the room. And he has a strong instinct for when he believes the industry has drifted away from its purpose. I think that's why he sits on boards as non-executive director. And it's certainly why I asked him to become the community leader for Asset Finance Connect's Asset Finance Community a few years ago. His thinking crops up repeatedly in our podcasts, our webcasts, our editorial, and our events. Stephen formally retired from full-time paid work some years ago, but he hasn't disappeared. Instead, he's chosen to stay right here in the middle of the industry, in the center of the industry, often but very tactfully asking those awkward questions that we need to be asked about behavior, incentives, and standards. So today I thought it would be interesting to start to explore that a little bit more. So Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for such a kind introduction.
Well, my pleasure. We'll start with the easy bit. Take us back right to the start. We're man and boy. So let's think about boy. How did you first end up working in lending?
But strangely enough, I was at school and I wanted to earn some money, and I took a job as a jobbing debt collector around the estates in Edgware. And that probably was my first formative experience of distress lending can cause and the difficulties people have with debt. And it's probably worth saying that sounds dramatic, but it was at the time. I'd been chased out of a block of flats by someone with a machete. I've been pinned to the wall and had the failures of a stereo system explained to me in great detail. I've even been offered sex in lieu of payment. Needless to say, I did not accept. I was too shy and ran off. But
So you learned to run fast,
yes, I did.
clearly, because you're here.
Yes. And
You
decided in the long run, recoveries was probably not my forte.
No carrot, and the stick's pretty awful. So you made this point when we chatted earlier about working across collections, operations, and other areas of the business. Why does seeing the whole system matter?
Well, that's a very good question. You can just work in one specialization, obviously, but having a real insight into the labor that goes behind both processing transactions, collecting the money, collecting the debt, dealing with all the things that can go wrong and putting them right, your IT systems, understanding them intrinsically, I think you just get a better overall picture of how the entire market works and what a company needs to do to run a portfolio of borrowers. You have
And
to.
clearly the impact that it has on its customers, on the SMEs to whom you're lending.
Absolutely. As you indicated earlier, when I was at school, I really wanted to be a geologist, so this is as close as I could get. I went out, I couldn't focus at school, and I went out looking for a job. I went to Alfred Marks, who were a big bureau back then, and they sent me to an interview with, it was called Schroeder Finance initially, and at that interview, for reasons I still don't fathom, I was offered a job as an assistant manager in the collections department. Within minutes of leaving school, I was sat in a department with probably about 30 or 40 people under my control, collecting money. And this, remember, was back in the 70s. So this was before things like the internet and mobile phones. We didn't have direct debits. So many things we didn't have that people now just take as read. The main job first thing in the morning was to deal with the post, and the post back then used to arrive on time and in huge amounts. And so there was a big pile of checks to sort through. And the first job of the day was to reconcile all of those and in the end work out who hadn't paid when they should have done and start chasing them. The other big thing I remember is from a credit assessment point of view, the only tool we really had, because credit reference agencies were only just starting to get off the ground, Dun and Bradstreet were in great big books in big volumes on a shelf that we had to look at. But the main tool was taking a reference from the customer's bank. And sometimes you had to wait a week for that in order to establish whether they were a good credit or not. And clearly, back in the day, the bank, if they thought they were good credit and didn't know about the requirement, would go off and offer it to the customer themselves, which was a very sensible thing to do, but it did make life very, very difficult.
It was somehow a slower world, perhaps more contemplative.
That's right. That's right. And yes, it was. It moved at nothing like the pace you see today.
And it delivered value for the customers? Well, you clearly you felt that this being the person you are, you felt that lending delivers value to its customers and does something special. Was it clear to you at that stage that that's what it was
Not at the
doing?
beginning. No, it was just a job, and I had more empathy with the people that owed the money that couldn't pay because of my roots that I've talked about. But slowly learned that there was a proportion of those people who actually just never had intended to pay, and or would just wanted to be difficult. But in the process, over time, I couldn't tell you exactly when, but it did dawn on me that, and it was probably when I joined the new business department and started seeing the other side of the coin. We were helping so many companies achieve what they needed to achieve. In order to grow, they generally need to borrow. And if that borrowing achieved what they wanted, they did grow, and then the economy grew. It became clear that actually lending is essential for a modern Western economy. And I do remember a couple of examples that stick in my head. One was I was put in charge of looking after a rather racy named company that had not long been trading to try and help them get whatever they needed, and that company was called Virgin. And you know where that's gone. And so that's got a big thing that stuck in the mind. And another one that I recall is I was working with what was called the Development Council. We were trying to turn a small village into a new town. And that went on for quite some years, financing them for all sorts of things, computers, big yellow equipment, stuff like that. And that town did come out as Milton Keynes. I actually now live not far from there, and it's now a city. So when you talk about the things that lending can do, that's the sort of thing.
But the results from lending aren't always good, are they? And from our conversation before, I got the feeling that there was at some stage you started to feel that the industry wasn't always serving its customers as well as it could. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Of course I can, and I think there are so many aspects to that, and you've got in every sector. I think there are people who don't behave properly, and our sector is no different. And I became aware of people mis-selling to customers, customers not being necessarily offered the right solution for their problem. It's quite difficult if you're talking to lay people; it'd be difficult to explain, but there are so many different financial offerings and they all work in different ways. What is most suitable for the customer's particular issue? For example, if it's cash flow all the time, they need a buffer, then back in the day, an overdraft was a suitable thing. Those are more difficult to get now, but you can have short term revolving loans and things like that. If they wanted a piece of equipment, they could potentially have hire purchase, or if they didn't want to own the equipment, they could have a lease rent it, in other words. But a lot of salespeople would just push them down the line of what the least resistance, what was the easiest thing to do.
When we talked about this earlier this week in the practice run, I suggested to you that this sort of unintended consequence was something that came out of a highly competitive commercial free market system. And you were very quick to correct me, and you said it's not about competition at all. It's about the tension between making money and doing the right thing. And that was an interesting thing to say, because very often the people who talk about what's wrong with the market are pointing at the free market system and saying that's not really the right place for this. We need to, if you like, a little in a return to the stuff that was happening in the dealerships. We need somebody who looks a bit more like a doctor or a well, not a lawyer, but a doctor to do this stuff, not the free market. But you're not saying that at all. Can you tell me a little bit about the tension between money and doing the right thing?
I can. I could expound for hours on that, but I'll try not to.
We can't.
I think the important thing to know is it is human nature to want whatever you can get, and that can stretch some time into greed. And a lot of customers are naive about finance and interest rates and things, and they can be taken advantage of. So if you get a naive customer and a greedy salesperson, then there's likely to be problem. The salesperson is clearly driven by a need to earn money, and if they were, say, not salaried but on a commission, then there's a drive to try and earn as much commission as possible. I do want to say at this stage, I am a fervent believer that any intermediary or broker is perfectly entitled to earn a fee from helping the customer get the right solution, perfectly entitled. And any lender is perfectly entitled to expect his money back, plus interest over the period agreed. And I've said it many times, I'd fight to the death for that. But it isn't helped. The reputation of the industry is not helped by people that push that line too far and will try and sell the customer the wrong thing in order to earn more money themselves.
So this is very, very interesting, and it sort of mirrors a conversation that was taking place in the recent dealership discussions that were happening in the appeal court, the Supreme Court, and so on. And it's about whether finance is different, really. And in that case, we talked about, well, we didn't talk about, they talked about car salesmen as if they were able to behave dishonestly and somehow act in their own interests and not always in the interest of the customer. And in some way that's acceptable. But when it comes to financial services, it was felt that it wasn't. And I know that you're not in favor of the broker having fiduciary duty, but what's the difference between selling somebody a car and selling them financial services? Why is it that trust is a really big, important part of financial services, but when it comes to car, it doesn't really matter whether you trust him or not. It's just a car.
I actually don't think it's any different. I don't think. What you often have in the car dealership is someone who's expert at selling finance and a car. I have some very strong views on all of these things. I have to be careful about what I say. A car dealer salesman has the list price of the car displayed. The customer knows what it is. He knows that's what he'd have to pay if he can't get any discount. And he might even negotiate a discount and then say he wants finance. On the finance side, the salesman in the old days was able to go and quite often set the commission, but it's a competitive world, as you said earlier. So he probably wouldn't try and get the maximum commission. He wants to move the car, and he would juggle with the commission that he can earn on the finance and the discount he can give on the car and come up with a deal that the customer would be satisfied with, the customer could afford. And personally, I think the Supreme Court came out right behind that and just agreed that that was a perfectly satisfactory situation. The trouble is, as I said earlier, sometimes individual salespeople push that line too far. But even in that circumstance, if they took the maximum commission that was reasonable at the time and the maximum profit on the car, they've made quite a good deal for themselves rather than the customer. I get that. That's probably the same with every single piece of equipment that is financed. But in the commercial world, which is where I mostly deal, businesses, generally speaking, those businesses know full well the value of the thing they're trying to finance. It's the interest rate and the commission that they don't fully understand.
Isn't that what the point is here that financial services products require a level of sophistication to understand. And it's very easy, as I think you were pointing at in the examples that you were using, to make something seem like it's good when it's not. And that,
And I'd
yeah,
interject
go on.
there and just say, yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. Interest rates is a perfect example of what you're talking about in the sense that it can be quoted in so many different ways. And if the customer's naive, it sounds good. If someone quotes what's called a flat rate, it's about half or less than the APR that the government would like you to use. So lots of salespeople try that on, and the customer can be fooled by that. Some people talk about so much percent per month or per quarter. Sounds very low when they don't really know what they're comparing it with. But when you multiply a monthly interest rate up to an annual interest rate, actually quite often it's too expensive. The whole issue of rates is an absolutely fascinating thing for me. I don't want to wander off into too much detail, but if you think about bank overdrafts, they might be, I think I'm right in saying that be somewhere in the 30% plus range, which is perfectly reasonable if somebody wants to borrow money in the short term, don't know how much, don't know when you're going to get it back. So the lender puts a high rate on it. I often refer to credit cards in the same way. I had a discussion on LinkedIn the other day where President Trump talked about 10% max on credit cards. Well, you're paying for the convenience of being able to buy a cup of coffee in Bolivia on your card, and the work that goes behind managing that, tracing it back to your account, putting it on your account, getting it on your bill, the convenience of that surely is worth more than 10%. The companies that provide these facilities have all these back offices. So as I was trying to say earlier, different products have different costs behind them in operating them. So it's not all about the interest rate. The lender itself will have different costs of operation, operational costs and costs of borrowing money. And all customers have different credit statuses. So if you're
So there are
dealing with
certainly reasons for charging more, but the point really is that it's very easy to mislead the customer about the nature of the deal that they're getting in finance.
It is exactly that. And I want to just reiterate again, the majority of people do it properly, but
Yes.
it's the minority that let the reputation of the
So
industry down.
so it's not just really about bad apples. When we spoke earlier, you talked about this being a problem that pervades more of the industry than just a few bad players. And there are always bad actors in any industry. But I think what you were trying to describe more, you used the phrase willful blindness. And I thought that was a very interesting phrase to use. Somehow you were talking about the industry picking up behaviors and normalizing them. Rationalizing them. So willful blindness suggests that some practices can build up within the industry that become normal and they no longer even see them as bad.
Yes,
And therefore
absolutely.
you've extended beyond the bad players to everybody behaving in that way and perhaps not even realizing after the first troubled moment.
That's absolutely right. Quite often things become so normal in the industry that it become part of the structure and that those waves can last quite a long time. There are certain products that come up which everybody thinks is a good wheeze, and they don't really see that the customer is suffering. They just see that it's easy to sell. Let me talk about minimum term rental leases for a minute. They became all the rage, and in leasing they became the norm, and everyone was trained how to sell them. And theoretically, there's nothing particularly wrong with them. But if you took a 3-year agreement, you amortize the equipment over the period of 3 years, you'd think if you didn't own it, and at least you don't own the equipment, something should happen at the end that gives you a benefit. Whereas on the minimum term, it just rolled on at the same frequency in rental. So whoever the lender was making super profits from the customer from that. If the customer didn't notice, the trade bodies, generally speaking, eventually have always stepped in and tried to curtail these problems. There are many more. I won't bore you with them today, but your question's quite right. It isn't just about the odd bad apple giving us a bad reputation. Sometimes the majority of the industry latches on to something. Right at the moment, there's a problem emerging, I think, in the loan market in that instead of offering customer, say, a lease if they want to hire equipment or HP if they want to buy it on credit, customers are being just offered a loan, a vanilla loan. And in one sense, that's fine, except if the customer does run into future problems, the only place the lender can take him to get his money back is to court. There's no intermediary step like, well, give me the equipment back, I'll sell that, mitigate your. That's how hire purchase and leasing came to fruition. They were the ways of giving credit to customers that couldn't justify credit. The other side of that coin at the moment is, what about those people who can't qualify for a loan? Are they getting edged out of the market? So these are the sort of structural things that you're talking about.
So the real question, I guess, that I asked you earlier this week was what can you do about it? And I can see that the trade bodies might be one of the places that one might go, or the regulators. I could say to you, is this a reason why we need the regulators? But when I asked you that question, you said the responsibility really sits with the industry itself. What did you mean by that?
Well, the trade bodies who've done a good job, I think, broadly speaking, they're there to look after their members. The regulator, you'd want as a sector to resist there being too much regulation. It's a burden. It costs money to regulate. And what a lot of people seem to forget, who are only loosely connected with the industry, our current regulator, the FCA, only regulates the consumer market. So the business market is unregulated. If there are bad behaviours there, surely the industry needs to try and stamp them out
But
and
aren't you
behave
saying
properly.
that even if we were inside the regulatory perimeter, that regulators aren't really the right ones to do that job? Their rule book doesn't necessarily work. Their principles might be fine, but their rule books don't really work. And if you really want to fix this sort of stuff, it's about ourselves. It's about the culture of the industry itself.
Well, I think you've answered your own question. That's exactly what I think. It's the culture of the industry, and bad practices need to be surfaced and taken out of the industry, and bad players need to be taken out of these. Bad products need to be. So at all times, the lenders mainly, but also the intermediaries who introduce business to them, should be looking to try and identify the customer's real needs and in their particular business, what might be the best type of financial solution, and then who might be the best funder to service this customer's type of credit for this type of product. So, yes, there's guidance. And a good broker in the commercial side of things would be doing exactly all those things. And
But if there's
should
cultural blindness implies that you've got to the stage where you can no longer see the good behavior over the bad, that you've normalized the bad. You had a golden rule of lending that you talked about that you felt might help the industry to
Well, I'm not sure if it's
distinguish.
it's not as precise as that. I think what I try to say to people is people do recognise what's fair and reasonable when it's put in front of them. By and large, they may not understand the interest rates and the commission behind it, but they think, well, that's not a bad deal. I can afford that. I'll take that. That goes right back to your Supreme Court decision, I think, where just people were going in to buy a car. They were sold it at a certain cost and rate on the finance. They said, I can afford that. I find that reasonable. I need the car. I want the car. I'll take the deal. That's just normal commerciality, isn't it? I don't have a problem with any of that, really. And not sure if I'm answering your question, but the golden rule that I talk about is really the intermediary or the lender trying to find where that line should be for the customer. What is reasonable?
You distinguish between symbiotic relationship and parasitic, I think was the one you use, if I remember it correctly. This symbiosis means that the two are working for mutual benefit, and parasitic means that you've crossed the
One
line, that
Yeah,
somehow the
parasitic, broadly speaking, parasitic is you're living at the expense of the other person. And if you took it into nature, you're probably bleeding them or sticking a disease into them, and ultimately you might kill them. Well, that's not what finance is there for. It is symbiosis, where both parties are benefiting from the engagement. And it absolutely always should be like that. And there are bodies around that seem to think that brokers shouldn't earn commission, it's some sort of bunts. It's not. It's their fee income, and they deserve it. If they can find the customer, save them time and find them the right solution and give them what they need to grow their company, then the intermediary deserves to earn a commission. But what should it be is a good question. Well, how much work have they had to put in? What's fairly normal in the general commercial market at the moment is somewhere between 3 and 7%. But you see the odd deal done here where it's 20 or 30%, and they haven't done much for it. And that's not reasonable. So there's your line, if you like. The golden rule. The trouble is I can't pin it down. Yeah.
Well, that the devil is in all of that. And I just wondered at this stage whether we could bring in the Guild of Business Finance Professionals. I hope I've said it correctly.
You have, and of course we can. And I'll be
Yeah,
very pleased to tell you what that's about.
you you've been involved in the industry for some years, some decades, and there are all these structures there that are set up to turn these principles into actionable stuff in the way that you're talking about. And you weren't really presenting your the golden rule of lending, but as an actionable principle. But you feel the need to be able to turn from the principles, from the good principles that you believe in, to something that works. At what stage did you come to feel that the existing structures weren't really addressing the problems you worried about?
Well, it's built up over years in me, but during the pandemic, quite a lot of discussions going on amongst intermediaries, brokers that is, uh, about being dissatisfied with all sorts of things. And I was asked to be chair of a new organisation, and I thought that rather than another trade body, because they exist, they look after their members, a guild was more suited in that its job is to look after the skill set and look after the end user borrower and the funder alike. And to be fair to both, and to provide some sort of badge of professionalism that customers could ultimately recognise and go to look for help. That's what the Guild is for. 13 founder members wanted to have a louder voice in the marketplace.
But do you see the guild as a, sounds rather fancy, but as a structural response to the cultural failures that you've been describing? Is that why is that
That
one of the contributing factors that caused you to do it, rather than just to create another industry group to give these people who wanted a slightly louder voice?
Yes, I think you're quite right. It appealed to me to be heading an organisation that wanted customers to understand how all these things work and know where to go to get professional help. And the guild can provide that. Not there are other places they can go, but the guild is focused totally on trying to provide potential borrowers with the right solution from the right source at fair and reasonable prices. And its starting point always with the lenders is, well, is your trading agreement with me, the broker, fair? And if it is, then we can endorse them. We don't tell brokers where to go to put their business, but we can endorse those that seem to us to behave properly towards the brokers. And so these are all parts of it. Coming back to your question, the Guild wants to see the reputation of the entire lending sector improve. And by default, they want to remove the bad practices.
Can we think about this emphasis on symbiosis? How does the guild help brokers think more clearly about what they're trying to achieve for their customers to create that symbiosis?
Well, they know it anyway because they're all skilled professionals with, to enter, you have to be recommended by the members and you have to have at least 5 years experience as a fully fledged intermediary. You know your stuff. And then you have to sign a charter, which explicitly says that your job is to do the right thing for your potential borrower and look after the funder alike. If you like, they've gone to a third party and committed to do these things properly. And therefore, customers can just take it as read that these people are trustworthy.
Is there anything else that you want to tell me about the guild that I haven't asked you?
No, I don't think so. It's up and coming. It has a very clear focus, and you've just heard what it wants to achieve. It gives those brokers of good repute a place to belong. It's the individual, not the firm. So it's a badge of professionalism for that individual. But I think the underlying thing that we haven't really talked much about in all of this is the problem, I think, in the borrowing lending market is that a lot of customers, because of the poor reputation engendered by the bad players or certain bad products or bad behaviors over time, do not trust the industry. They do not trust it enough. We've got to build that trust back up. The government were consulting not long ago about how to get more SMEs to borrow. And we put in a response to that, which effectively was saying, well, there's a large slice of that unborrowed market which probably shouldn't borrow because they can't afford to pay it back. There's that. Then there's another slice, which is those businesses that are quite happily making sufficient profit. They don't need to borrow. They don't want to grow. So there's that. And then there's another big slice who probably could borrow and could grow, but don't know where to go to get the right help and do not trust the market.
So, if I was to sum all this up, if there was one small practical thing you'd like people in this industry to do differently tomorrow, it would be focusing more on building trust. Is that what you want?
Good question. I heard Trump the other day answering the question about what was the one thing he'd done that he was really proud of. And he said, I can't, there's too many things that come from that but there are literally thousands of things I'd like to change. But I think, coming back to your question, if
This
there
is
was,
like Desert Island Discs, Stephen. You had
yes,
to choose one.
okay, we'll choose one. It would actually be that the entire market woke up tomorrow and started actually applying the FCA's principles to every borrowing, every lending, not the rules and the regulations, the principle. Because if they did, then customers could trust the market. And I think the economy would start to move in the right direction.
Excellent point. Stephen Bassett, thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing your perspectives so
Thank you.
openly. It's been an interesting conversation. What strikes me listening to Stephen is that his views aren't an argument against markets. They're not an argument against profit or competition. They're an argument really about purpose, about remembering that finance only works when it strengthens the people and businesses it depends on. Relationships, he tells us, should be symbiotic, not parasitic. Judgment, common sense, and fairness matter at least as much as structuring or speed. And this all feels less like a technical fix and more like a cultural fix. And perhaps, when you think about it, that's why it's harder to hear and also why it matters more. And most important, and perhaps most uncomfortable of all, Stephen's argument is difficult because it doesn't give us somebody else to blame. If we want the market to be a better place for everyone, for customers, for our colleagues, Stephen is saying we need to fix the flaws in ourselves, in our own industry. Well, it's been an interesting session. Thank you very much indeed for listening.